Hello again, Introduction to Philosophy students. This week we will be talking about Ultimate Questions Chapter 3, What Do We Know? Theories of Knowledge. Specifically, I'll start with an introduction. Then we will talk about the definition of knowledge as true justified belief. And then we'll look at three theories of knowledge: skepticism, empiricism, and rationalism. So to begin with an introduction, epistemology, that's the name of the study of knowledge. That's what we're going to be talking about. And I want to ask you to do a quick exercise before we get started. And that is to draw a little T-chart like this on a piece of paper. And on one side of the paper, write things I know. And on the other side, write things I merely believe. And then try to write down some things you know on the left side and some things you merely believe on the right side. If you don't want to actually write this down, and there's no way for me to know whether you actually do or not, just think about it. Think about some things you would say you know, period, for sure. You feel confident that you would count them as instances of knowledge, of actually knowing something. And other things that you believe are true, but you might not say that you know that they're true. Okay, so think of some things on each side and write them down. You can pause the video, grab a pen and paper if you don't have one already handy. I will add that one of the discussion prompts for your discussion boards is about this exercise. So if you don't do it right this moment and you want to respond to this prompt with your group, then you'll have to do it by then anyway. But regardless, you should think of some things you would count as knowing and some things you would count as merely believing. And then try to ask, so you might need to pause the video to get at least a few things in your mind. Then I want to know, what's the difference for you? What makes the difference between something you count on the left side as something you know and something that you would only count on the right side, something you merely believe? I look forward to hearing how you divide up these columns if you choose this discussion prompt. Okay, but that's what we're talking about in this lecture, is the things that you put on the left side of the column. What does it take for something to qualify as something you know? Okay, another preliminary comment is that there are three kinds of knowledge that we can distinguish here that the author talks about in the beginning of this chapter. We're only talking about one of those kinds of knowledge when we discuss theories of knowledge and epistemological theories. So the first kind is knowledge how. So knowledge how is how you would say you know how to play the piano or how to ride a bike or how to rappel off mountains. Any kind of thing that requires some type of skill that you have, that's something we often say we know how to do, but we're not talking about knowledge in that sense in this chapter. Okay, so knowledge how is one kind of knowledge. It's knowledge involving skills, things like playing the piano or riding the bike, and that's not the kind of knowledge that we're discussing in this chapter. Another kind of knowledge that we're not discussing is knowledge by acquaintance. So you might say that you know Raleigh really well, or you know campus really well, or you know your friend's stepmother, or any other person that you're familiar with. So this is kind of knowledge is a form of familiarity with something or someone. And this also is not the kind of knowledge that we're talking about. So we're not talking about knowledge by acquaintance. The kind of knowledge that we're talking about here in this chapter is propositional knowledge. And that is knowledge of a proposition. A proposition is kind of like a fact. It's something that you know is true, or something that you know to be the case. Sometimes we call it knowledge that, or knowing that P. And here P is just standing for anything you could put after the that in the sentence. I know that blank. Anything you could put in the blank is a kind of proposition. Okay, so we're talking about knowing facts, knowing that certain things are the case. That's the kind of knowledge we're looking at. So again, we're not talking about knowledge how, like how to play the piano or how to ride a bike. We're not talking about knowledge of familiarity, like knowing your best friend's stepmother. We're talking about propositional knowledge, that is knowledge of propositions, or knowing that something is the case. Okay, so that brings us to our next section, knowledge is true, justified belief. So this is the definition that is sort of viewed as the classical definition of knowledge within epistemology. And there's a whole lot of discussion over whether this is the right definition. And when we are exploring that question, momentarily, you should try to recall the things from chapter 2 about what a definition is trying to do and the role of necessary and sufficient conditions. Okay, so when we talk about the definition of knowledge, what we're trying to get at is the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to count as knowledge. So think back to your T-chart. What did you put on the left side and what did you put on the right side? What does it take for something to count as being something you know, as opposed to just being something you merely believe? And the first necessary condition that is proposed in this chapter is that in order to know something, you have to believe it. So you have to believe something in order to count as knowing it. If you don't agree with that condition proposed as a necessary condition, then one thing you should try to do is think of a counterexample. Think of something you know, you would say you know, but you don't believe. It seems kind of weird to think of something that you know, but you don't even believe it. Though I have had students propose examples, like one student said, how about you know your partner is cheating on you, but you don't want to believe it? I'll leave that to you to discuss. Is that a counterexample to belief counting as a necessary condition for knowledge? I leave that to you to think about for yourself, okay? Or maybe you can think of another example. But most people accept that in order to know something, you have to actually believe it. You don't get to count as knowing it without believing it. And that makes belief a necessary condition for knowledge. You have to believe something in order for it to count as knowledge. It's necessary to believe it in order for it to count as knowledge. However, belief by itself is not sufficient. That means there are lots of things we believe that we don't count as knowing, like all the things perhaps that you put on the right side of your T-chart. And we get this lottery example that shows that even a very strong belief doesn't count as knowledge. It takes more than just believing something. Even if you believe it very, very strongly, it takes more than that for something to count as knowledge. And the lottery example says, look, suppose you buy a ticket and you have less than 1 in a million chance of winning. Do you know that your ticket is a losing ticket? Well, most of us would say, no, you don't really know that your ticket is a losing ticket until they actually draw the winner, and then you see whether your ticket won or not. But you have every reason to believe very strongly that your ticket is not a winner because only 1 in a million tickets will win. Less than 1 in a million tickets will win. So you may have the very strong belief that your ticket will not win the lottery, but nonetheless, that very strong belief doesn't count as knowledge before the lottery is actually drawn, because there's still a chance that you might win. So this example is supposed to show that even a very strong belief in something, like the belief that your ticket will not win the lottery, is not itself sufficient to count as knowledge, even though it's necessary to believe something in order to get to count as knowing it. Okay, what else do we need? Well, another proposed condition is that in order to know something, it actually has to be true. Okay, so you can't know something if it's false. That seems reasonable, right? If something is false, if you have a false belief, you're just wrong about that thing, then you don't get to count as knowing it, even if you believe it. Okay, truth is being offered here as a necessary condition for knowledge. So far we have true belief as part of our definition. So in order to know something, it has to be true and you have to believe it. Those are the two conditions we've looked at so far. Yet, those two conditions together are also not sufficient for knowledge. So there's something more that we need in addition to having a true belief in order for it to count as knowledge. And the quiz show example is taken to show that truth and belief, even together, even having a true belief, is not itself sufficient for something to count as knowledge. The quiz show example says, suppose you're on a quiz show and you, or somebody else, we're imagining, on a quiz show, and they have a question and there's multiple choice answer and they guess C as the answer, and it turns out they're correct. So they come to believe that C is the answer and it's true. They got the right answer, but they don't know that they got the right answer because they just guessed and they just happened to get it right. So the suggestion here is that truth and belief are not, even taken together, having a true belief is not enough. It's not enough. It's not sufficient to count for something to count as knowledge. Because what if you just guessed and now you have a true belief, but you have no basis for even believing it? It was just a guess. So you don't get to count as knowing on this view. That's what the claim is. That's what the quiz show example is supposed to be arguing for. Okay, so what else do we need? Well, the classical proposal is that in addition to having a true belief, your belief has to be justified. That is, you have to have good reasons for holding it. And what counts as a good reason, that's what we're going to spend the rest of the lecture talking about, because what different theories of knowledge disagree about is what it takes to justify a belief in the right way for that belief to count as knowledge. We're going to look at different proposals for what counts as a justification. But we're going to accept that this is the definition we're going to work with. Knowledge is true justified belief. In order to have knowledge, you have to have a belief. That was the first condition that we said was necessary. It has to be true. That's the second necessary condition. And it has to be justified. What that means we're going to talk about, but we accept that it just has to have, you have to have some basis for believing it so that we don't end up counting random guesses as knowledge, because we don't want those to count as knowledge. And remember that when we have a definition, when we propose a definition and we're trying to decide what's the right definition, and again, we're talking about real definitions, not lexical definitions. So we're drawing on a lot of information from the previous chapter. When we're trying to understand the real definition of knowledge, and we have this proposal, true justified belief, that is supposed to capture the necessary and sufficient conditions, the goal of our definition is to draw the line in the right place. So we want everything that we think is an instance of knowledge to count as knowledge under this definition, and we want everything that's not an instance of knowledge to not count. And that's why a counterexample could be an objection. If you said, here's something that we'd count as knowing or not knowing, but it doesn't fall under the definition in the right way. Okay, so the idea here is that each of these conditions, true, justified, belief, something being true, it being justified, and it being a belief, is necessary for something to count as knowledge. And the claim here, as we are proposing this as the definition of knowledge, is that together, all these three conditions are sufficient for something to count as knowledge. And again, if we are claiming that having a true justified belief is necessary and sufficient for counting something as knowledge, we want to make sure that line is drawn in the right place. So this is at least the classical view that's proposed, but a lot of people have said that definition doesn't cut it. It doesn't draw the line in the right place, because here's something that we would say you do count as knowing, but it's not a true justified belief. Or what is more often proposed is a counterexample that says, here's something that's a true justified belief, but we wouldn't want to count it as knowledge. And so I leave that to you. Can you think of a counterexample that is something that's a true justified belief that you don't believe counts as knowledge? And there are lots of these examples around that people have written about, and I'll just give you one classical example, is that you walk into the town square and you look up at the clock. Well, you should pause and try to think of your own example before you hear my example, if you want to play along at home. But the example is you walk into the town square and you look up at the clock and it says it's 3 o'clock, say, And so you form the belief that it's 3 o'clock, and it is actually 3 o'clock. So you have a true belief because it's correct, it's 3 o'clock. It's a belief because you come to believe it, and it's justified because you believed it on the basis of looking at the town clock. Now, the catch is that the clock is broken and it's just stuck on 3 o'clock. We're imagining clocks with hands, not a digital clock. It's just stuck on 3 o'clock, and you just happen to look at the clock at exactly the right time for your belief that you formed on that basis to come out true. Well, does looking at a broken clock give you knowledge of what time it is? Most of us, at least the people who propose this example, argue that most of us would say, no, you can't get in a knowledge about what time it is by looking at a broken clock, even if you look at the clock at the time that it's broken, portraying, right? So that's a counterexample. And philosophy is full of this kind of dialogue where somebody proposes a definition, a set of necessary and sufficient conditions, and somebody else comes along and proposes a counterexample. Then we try to revise the definition to meet the counterexample to help draw the line in a better place. Remember, we're trying to divide, we're trying to distinguish all the things that count as knowledge from all the things that don't count as knowledge with our proposed necessary and sufficient conditions. So there's a lot of this. A lot of, here are the necessary and sufficient conditions for some concept, and then here's a counterexample, so you have to revise, and back and forth, until some people came along and said, you know what? Necessary and sufficient conditions are not the right way to capture a concept. Why think that we can just rephrase every concept in terms of different words? That doesn't really get us anywhere. It's not an improvement, and that's not how concepts and meaning and understanding, that's not how these things work. So this idea of doing this kind of conceptual analysis, which we said in the first lecture is like one of the definitive features of academic philosophy, people have challenged that very project, the nature of that project, and whether it's a useful way to think about our concepts. Nonetheless, we're not going to get deeper into that discussion, though you could if you keep taking philosophy classes or reading philosophy, but we're just going to accept that knowledge as true justified belief is the classical definition of knowledge, and we're going to just use that definition as what we've got to work with as we move on in this lecture to explore theories of knowledge. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. We're talking about true justified belief, and it's belief in propositions, not skills or know-how or knowledge of acquaintance or any of those other kinds of knowledge. We're talking about propositional knowledge and the proposed definition of propositional knowledge that we're just going to accept and work with because we can't solve every problem in one lecture. We're not going to solve any problems in one lecture. But for the sake of moving forward, we're going to accept this proposed definition, this proposal that having a true justified belief is sufficient for knowledge, what we would say is jointly sufficient. These properties of it being true, justified, and being a belief are together sufficient, and each one of them by itself is necessary as our proposed definition of knowledge. We're just going to work with it and move forward. Okay, so the first theory of knowledge, and there are 3 theories that we're going to look at, and those are laid out, I believe, on page 60. I put it in here, so we'll get to it. I might have just said the wrong page, but the first theory is skepticism, and the skeptic denies that we can know anything. The skeptic just says knowledge is impossible. And the author talks about local skepticism, where you deny that we can know anything within a particular subject area, like you might be a skeptic about astrology or psychics or religion. You might deny that we can gain knowledge from these types of limited sources within these limited realms. But the more interesting kind of skepticism is the skepticism that says, no, it's not just within some limited realm that we can't know anything. It's a kind of global skepticism, this idea that we can't know anything at all. And you might think, well, that's crazy. Of course we can know stuff. Like I know my name and I know who my parents are and whatever else you put on the left side of your T-chart. But skepticism says, no, actually, everything, even the stuff you feel most confident in, the stuff that you believe you know the strongest, belongs on the right side of that page, on the merely belief side, and doesn't get to count as knowledge. So why might we believe in skepticism? Well, we're going to talk a lot about Descartes in this section because Descartes gave what is still one of the most convincing arguments for skepticism. And it's important to note that Descartes was not a skeptic. We're going to get to that. He presented skepticism in order to defeat it, in order to show us that he had a way to defeat the skeptic. But in true philosophical fashion, he tried to give us the strongest case he could for believing in skepticism before he showed that he can defeat it, because that will make his objection to skepticism even stronger if he's really given the skeptic a fair chance, right? He wants to give the skeptic the best shot at compelling us to believe skepticism in order to give the strongest case against it that he can, okay? But a lot of people think that Descartes' argument for skepticism was even stronger than his attempt to defeat it. So he kind of left us with this legacy of having this compelling reason to believe in skepticism, even though his whole goal was to show us that we can reject it. And that's why we start with Descartes in looking at skepticism, because of this great argument. And this is a shortened version of the argument that you'll find the longer version of in the text. But here it is. So premise 1, it is impossible to distinguish with certainty between dream experiences and waking experiences. Premise 2, if it is impossible to distinguish with certainty between dream experiences and waking experiences, then I cannot know that I'm awake right now. The conclusion, I cannot know that I'm awake right now. Okay, so the idea is that if you can't even know you're awake, then you really can't know anything else, right? Because anything you think you know may be totally different than what you take yourself to be experiencing, right? Like I had a dream last night that I was in a candy store with my mom and we were getting to taste anything we wanted. And I was showing my mom all my favorite candies. And I was completely convinced in that moment that I was experiencing reality. I remember tasting the candy. It was watermelon. And it turned out that not only was I not in a candy store with my mom, I was actually asleep in my bed. So things are not what they seem when we're asleep. And the idea of this argument, the first premise, is that it is impossible to tell the difference between sleeping experiences when we're asleep and waking experiences when we're awake. We can't, from the inside, distinguish between those. That's why whenever we're dreaming, we're convinced that what we're experiencing is actually real, at least almost all of the time. Maybe some of you have had this experience they call lucid dreaming, where you realize that you're sleeping while you're asleep. If you've had that, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. But most of the time, our dreams are not lucid dreams. They're just dreams that we believe and take at face value and believe that they represent reality. And since they are so far from reality, I wasn't in a candy store, I was lying in my bed. We can't know that in our waking life that reality is any more real than we take it to be in our dreams. That's the motivation of this argument, is that from the inside, they're just as realistic seeming. But if it's impossible to distinguish between them, then we don't know that we're awake, because other times we believed we're awake and it turned out we were asleep. So now we believe you're awake. You believe you're awake. You probably believe that you're watching this lecture on a screen. And in front of you, there's a computer. These are the kinds of beliefs that seem the surest. But even those we can't be sure of, because it could turn out that you're having a dream. And I have had this dream where I'm delivering this material in front of a classroom. And afterwards, it was weird because it turned out I was in my bed the whole time, asleep. So the question is, well, the point is that we can't know that our experiences, whatever we're experiencing right now, is real because it could turn out that you're about to wake up in your bed and start your day. And this whole lecture is just a figment of your imagination. That's Descartes' argument for skepticism. Now, I said Descartes was not a skeptic, right? He's trying to present the strongest case for skepticism that he can show, so that he can show even the strongest case for skepticism can be defeated. And so in order to understand his methodology, I want to say a little bit more about it. Okay, so Descartes here is using the method of doubt. And the method of doubt is a way of trying to clear his mind of all the beliefs that he can doubt. Okay, that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to start from scratch so that he can make sure that each belief that gets put back into his mind, right, each belief that he takes up again, he can be absolutely certain is true. Okay, so his method of doubt is to remove from his belief set any belief that can be doubted. And once he's cleared the ground, think of a building, okay? Think of building a new building. Descartes is a foundationalist, okay? Which means that he is trying to build a foundation of knowledge where all of his belief set is going to rest on that foundation. And he wants to be sure that each part of that foundation, each belief he adopts, is indubitable. Indubitable means it cannot be doubted. And what that is for Descartes is that he wants to prevent having any belief where it could be the case that he believes it and it's false. Okay? He wants to eliminate that as a logical possibility. Eliminate the possibility that some belief he has is false. Okay? That some belief, something is both believed by him and false. He wants to rid his mind of all the beliefs that could meet those two criteria at once. Okay? So he wants to make sure his beliefs cannot even be doubted. That is, he cannot even question whether they're true because they have to be true. That's what indubitability is. It means cannot be doubted. And for Descartes, what that means is that it's not even possible that he can believe it and it turn out to be false. Okay, so the method of doubt is to start from scratch, is to look at his beliefs and remove all the beliefs that are not indubitable. That is, all the beliefs that he can doubt. Okay, so all the beliefs that it's even logically possible that he believes them and they're false, he wants to set those aside. And that's why he's presenting the argument for skepticism, to say, well, look, all the beliefs that are coming through my senses, all these beliefs like that I'm standing in this room, that there's a ball right here, right? That there's a computer in front of me, that I'm looking at a screen, that there's sunlight coming in the window, all these beliefs that are coming from my experience right now, because of the dream argument, I know that they can be doubted. It's possible that they're false because it's possible that I'm dreaming. And that is what the dream argument is supposed to show. Okay, so he wants to clear out of his mind all of his beliefs that are based on perception so that he can get a rock solid belief that can serve as a foundation in his whole epistemic system. Okay, this whole system of knowledge, how he's going to build his beliefs back in, he wants to start from a solid foundation with one belief that he cannot even doubt. And so what he thinks he's shown with the dream argument is that that cannot be a belief that's based on perception, because all of his perceptual beliefs can be doubted because all of his perceptual beliefs turn out to be wrong whenever he wakes up from a dream and realizes that he had all these beliefs that were based in his experience that were completely wrong. They turn out to be false. Okay, so there's a lot of information here and a lot going on with his method of doubt and this concept of indubitability and foundationalism. There's some guy building a foundation. Make sure you understand all the bits and pieces, because this is the role that skepticism is playing in Descartes' methodology. He's not a skeptic. He's going to say, even though we can doubt all these beliefs, there's still one thing I can be absolutely sure of that will be that first brick in my foundation that all the rest of my belief set can rest upon, so that I can have complete certainty. That is, not even the possibility that my belief is false. And what is that rock solid belief that starts his foundation going? Well, he presents that in this argument called the cogito. And that belief is, I think. Okay, so now, why does I think meet this very high standard that we get from Descartes? Well, because again, he wanted his beliefs to be indubitable, which means that he wants to make sure that it cannot be the case that he believes it and it's false at the same time. He wants to rule out that possibility. Now, why does I think meet that criteria? Because if you believe I think, then you're actually making it true that you're thinking, because belief is a form of thinking. Okay, so I think has this unique status in Descartes' epistemology, because it, after he's cleared his mind of all perceptual beliefs, like this is a ball, this is my hand, there's sunlight, all of those, and even mathematical beliefs, he's discounted those with the evil demon argument, which you can go back and read about. This stuff is all been repeated in different forms, arguments of the same spirit, and the Matrix is probably the one you might be most familiar with. But I think has this special status in Descartes' epistemology because it cannot be true. It cannot be that you believe it and it's false, because each time you believe it, you make it true. Each time you think it, it becomes true, because thinking is what the sentence is about. So if you are believing, I think, believing itself is a form of thinking. If you tried to doubt whether I think, if I tried to doubt it, and it has to be in the first person, okay? Descartes isn't concluding that anyone else is thinking. You have to do it for yourself in the first person as well. But anytime you believe or try to doubt, I think, you're again making it true, because doubting is also a form of thinking. Okay, so that's why this sentence, I think, has this special status for Descartes, because each time it's believed, it's made true in the act of believing it. And for Descartes, I think is all the stuff that happens in your mind, including your beliefs and your feelings and your perceptions, and all of these states are considered forms of thought for Descartes. And so believing that you're doing these things makes itself true. Okay, so again, he's trying to avoid any beliefs that are dubitable. And he believes that this belief, I think, done in the first person, is indubitable, because it cannot be that you believe it and it's false. And his conclusion is that I must exist. Okay, that I think, therefore I must exist. You can't do anything if you don't exist. Okay, so that's Descartes' cogito. The reason we're talking about it under this section of skepticism is that it is his response to skepticism. This is how he believes he's defeated the skeptic. And the argument for skepticism is what I gave a few slides ago, the dream argument, which says that because you can't tell the difference between being awake and asleep at the time that you're experiencing them, you can't know that you're awake. And if you can't know that you're awake, then what really can you know? I mean, you can't know anything that you believe based on seeming to experience the world, right? You can't believe any of that stuff because when you're asleep, all that stuff turns out to be wrong. This is Descartes' argument for skepticism, and it's actually a rationalist argument. So we're going to talk about rationalism at the end of this lecture, but Descartes is a rationalist, and the reason he's a rationalist is because rationalists think what we know is based on reason, is based on thinking, okay? It's based on just using your mind to access that knowledge, that's the surest foundation for justification, right? Like I said at the beginning, the theories that we're looking at disagree about what constitutes a good enough justification, and a rationalist thinks that reason is a good justification, using your mind and your powers of reason to access the truth. That's the best justification. And I think is a plain example of a fact that we can access based on reason just by thinking about it. Okay, so that's part of how Descartes' cogito fits into this larger picture. Now, I want to again recommend that you split up this lecture into parts. And now we're going to move on to empiricism. So now's a good time to go for a hike and then come back another day and finish the lecture so that you can start with a fresh tools, fresh mind, and take care of yourself in the process. So, but I'm going to continue because I'm excited to tell you about empiricism. So the skeptic says we can't know anything. The empiricist and the rationalist both say, yeah, we can know a lot of stuff, and they disagree about what the basis of that knowledge is. For the empiricist, knowledge is based on perception. I see I have a hand, therefore I have a hand. It's that simple for the empiricist, really. It looks like I have a hand, I have a hand. And the empiricist will say, and there was actually G.E. Moore gave this lecture where he just stood up and said, looks like I have a hand, here's a hand, and here's another hand. Therefore, there's reality. There's stuff outside of my mind, right? That's all it takes. And it's like a page long, and you can go look it up. That was his method of arguing. And his point was that even if we can't tell what's wrong with the dream argument, even if we can't see why we want to reject the conclusion, we can be more certain by looking at our hands that we have hands than we can be of whatever convoluted, trippy argument the skeptic has put forth, right? It's more sure. It's a more sure thing that I have a hand, or that this is a ball or a quarter. These things are more certain than whatever argument Descartes has provided defending skepticism, right? Even if we can't tell what's wrong with the skeptic's argument, even if we can't spot what's wrong with it, our knowledge that we're actually interacting in the world, that you're looking at a computer screen, hearing me talk, is more certain than that. Okay? That's the guiding force of empiricism. Now, I said before that the theories of knowledge were on page 60. I was getting that mixed up with theories of perception, which are on page 60. The theories of knowledge are a few pages before that. But we're going to talk about, in this discussion of empiricism, the idea that knowledge is based on perception, on what we perceive through our senses. We can see, hear, smell, taste, feel, and we get knowledge that way by using our senses. That's empiricism. So we're going to talk now about 3 different theories of perception, of what it is to perceive something. And the empiricist is going to have to say more about the relationship between our senses and the outside world and the stuff that we're actually sensing. And so there are sort of 3 different views that we're going to look at in this chapter of perception. And these are the three views: naive realism, indirect realism, and idealism. Okay, so naive realism is the most straightforward. Okay, again, these are three ways to understand perception, which the empiricist needs to do if they're going to say that knowledge is based on perception. We want to understand how perception works and what it is exactly. Naive realism says things are basically the way we take them to be. So you see this red ball? It seems roughly spherical, a little dented in some places and lopsided, but it's a red ball. That's naive realism, right? That in my hands, I have this object. It seems like a ball. It seems red. It's a red ball. That's how easy it is. Okay? That's how straightforward perception and reality. So we have perception experiences the stuff in our minds, and we have this world outside of our minds. And the question these different theories of perception are trying to answer is, what's the connection between the stuff outside of our minds, like the ball or the quarter, and the stuff inside of our minds, the sensation of seeing something red, or the experience of feeling something slightly weighted. It has some mass. I can toss it. It comes back into my hand, right? What's the relation between those feelings and sensations inside my mind and the ball itself? And the naive realist says they're basically the same, okay? That the experiences I'm having are giving me knowledge about the world outside my mind. Direct knowledge. It's just, here's a red ball. I'm experiencing a red ball. Everything lines up. You'll see, though, that the naive realist runs into trouble almost immediately, because perception does not always tell us what's actually going on in reality. And as an example, take this quarter again. Right? This quarter is round. You see this round quarter, okay? Now, watch me change the shape of the quarter. You ready? Now, this quarter is just a little line, or maybe it's a very narrow oval, based on your perspective. From my perspective, now it's just a thin line, right? But I can make it go back to a circle. Ta-da! You didn't know that there would be a magic show as part of today's lecture, did you? Okay, now, of course, you know, because you've touched quarters enough and played around with them and seen how they change when you move them and how it seems to change when you perceive it, that I'm not actually changing the shape of the quarter, okay? But in your mind, it looks as if the quarter is going from round, circle, to a line. Line, maybe it's even seeming to disappear, but it's still here. I have it in my hand. I'll make it round, then gradually turn it into a line, right? Okay, or here's another example. The ball. So this ball, I'm going to throw it, right? And let me know, or think for yourself, how does it move, all right? Which direction is it moving, right? Well, ready? Hopefully it won't break anything. That was loud. I hope I didn't wake the baby. Okay, so for you, it probably moved left to right across your screen, hopefully, unless it was completely out of sight or something because I aimed poorly. But for me, it just went straight. It just got smaller and then went down. Well, actually, it got smaller and went down at the same time. Okay, because I was facing the ball as I threw it, and you were facing my side as I threw the ball. So it moved from left to right for you, but for me, it just got smaller and went down. Okay, so we know that there weren't two events there. There weren't two throwings of the ball. I only threw the ball one time. But we had very different perceptions of what happened. right? Because from my perspective, the ball just got smaller and moved down. From your perspective, the ball moved left to right and down. And what that shows is that naive realism, what it's taken to show, is that naive realism can't be the right picture of things, because naive realism says perception and reality just go hand in hand. They're the same. When it seems like something is round, it's round, right? And if it seems like a ball is red, it's red. If it seems like something is big, it's big. And if it seems like something is smaller, then it's smaller, right? Naive realism says how you perceive things to be is how they actually are. But these examples of the ball seeming one way to you and a different way to me, or the quarter seeming to change shape right in front of your eyes, don't actually represent changes in reality. They're changes in our perception that don't correspond to changes in reality. And what that is taken to show is that naive realism can't be the whole story, that we need some more complex theory of how our experiences, what's happening on the inside of our minds, actually line up with what's happening on the outside of our minds in reality, out in the world. And indirect realism is supposed to offer that additional complexity that is needed. The indirect realist says that sometimes, for some properties of objects, how we perceive them is how they actually are. Some properties of objects are actually accurately represented in our minds. That is, we're making contact with the thing as it actually is in itself outside of our minds. We can perceive that within our minds. Okay, so for some things, according to the indirect realist, there is perception and reality correspond. There's correspondence between how things seem inside our minds and how things are out there in the world. For other properties of objects, according to the indirect realist, things are not actually as they seem. Perhaps some things are only in our minds and they're not out there in reality. So standardly, and this is attributed to John Locke, who the author is talking about here, there's been a distinction between primary and secondary properties, where primary properties includes all the stuff that we actually perceive being in the object itself, that actually is in the object. Okay, so things like shape, according to the indirect realist, is a primary property. What something is shaped like is part of the thing in itself. Whereas color, according to the indirect realist, most often, is a secondary property. It's only in our minds. And it's because we're interacting with the object that we get that perception. But nonetheless, it's still only in our minds. Okay, so this ball has a primary property of being whatever size it is and being spherical. Two primary properties. I didn't measure it. But the color of the ball is in our minds. The ball itself doesn't actually have any property that constitutes its color, right? Color is not a property of the object. It's a property that happens in our mind when we interact with the object. And to see that that's true, consider that probably the color of that ball looks different on different screens. And it might even look different if we were both standing in the same room looking at the ball. We might have slightly different color perceptions of the ball. Or maybe you're colorblind and so the ball doesn't have any color to you, but it looks sort of pinkish pink to me. Okay, so for the indirect realist, some properties that we perceive are actually in the objects themselves, and some properties happen only in our minds as a result of interacting with the objects outside of our minds. Okay, the primary properties are the ones that are actually in the objects themselves, and the secondary properties are properties that are really only in our minds as a result of us interacting with the object. So there's still a close connection between our perception, what's happening in our mind, and the outside world, but it's a little more complicated for the indirect realist than the naive realist. Okay, so that's again how we respond to the objection to naive realism that says things aren't always as they seem. Okay, you put a fork in the glass of water, it looks bent, but it's not bent. And we know that it's not bent. Okay, so naive realism cannot be correct. Indirect realism is supposed to give us a better understanding of the relationship between perception and reality by adding this complexity. Unfortunately, it has problems of its own. Okay, so one problem is this distinction between primary and secondary properties. Well, I said that things like shape are in the object and things like color are secondary properties in our minds. But look, again, the quarter changes shape according to our experience in our perception, but it doesn't change its actual shape of itself. So it seems like the difference between primary and secondary properties is not has not been drawn in the right place, because the shape of the object also seems to be different in our perception based on our perspective on the coin. Okay? Also, once we've distinguished between things that are in our minds and things that are supposed to be in the objects themselves, then we can ask, well, how do we access the objects to know what they're really like independently of our minds? How do we access the objects in themselves outside of our minds without just relying on the experiences and the perception that we have from interacting with the object? And the answer is we can't. We cannot get out of our minds and assess what the objects are like in themselves. That's just not, we're always interpreting the world through our senses and our perception. And so the idea of making this kind of direct contact with the outside world is just doesn't really make any sense. We're trapped inside our minds. All we have for accessing the outside world is our mind and our experiences and our perception. And so the indirect realist can't really tell us how we can draw that distinction, how we can know what's actually out there in the world and what's just in our minds, because the world is mediated through our minds. We perceive the world through our experiences. And so we can't really know how things are in themselves. And that is presented as a difficulty for the indirect realist, and one that leads us to idealism. Well, idealism is counted as a form of empiricism because it's still saying knowledge is based on perception, but it's just dropping the whole outside world bit. Okay? It's a way to just sidestep the problem of understanding how our experiences make contact with the outside world. How do we sense, how do our sensations, the sensation of seeing red when I look at that ball I threw over there, idealism is a way of just forgetting about the outside world, saying, look, there's no outside world. All we have is our perception. And so what it is for something to exist is just to be in our perception. Okay, so the idealist doesn't have this problem of explaining how we can ever make contact with the outside world. They're just denying that there is some kind of mind-independent reality out there. Everything is in our senses. And like the other theories of perception that we've looked at, idealism has really difficult problems that it encounters. Like one, how do you explain errors in perception? How do you explain times when we're wrong about what we perceive? So we think we see a lake in the desert, but actually we're hallucinating because we're so thirsty and we've been wandering for days and we think there's a lake up there, but there's just not. And so if everything that exists in perception, if existing is being perceived, if that's what it is to exist, is to be perceived, then there's not going to be a difference between thinking there's a lake when there's no lake and thinking there's a lake when there is a lake, because to be a lake is just to be perceived as a lake. So the idealist has this debilitating problem. Okay, so again, the empiricist is giving us a theory of justification of what it takes to have a belief that counts as knowledge. For the empiricist, that belief has to be justified on the basis of perception. And what we've just looked at is 3 different theories of perception, of how that story gets told. That story about the relationship between perception and the world. How is it that perceiving something provides a justification for believing it? And under what circumstances does perception get to count as a justification that's strong enough to give us knowledge of something? Okay, there's a lot that we've been talking about. So again, if you need to take a break, now is another good time. But we're not done talking about empiricism. But okay, so please don't try to take in too much at once. Okay, so one more thing I want to say about empiricism is how it's responding to the skeptic. So the author says there are 3 ways that you can respond to the dream argument, to the argument for skepticism that we've looked at. One is to just accept it and become a skeptic, to say, yeah, you're right. Like, I thought I knew a bunch of stuff. There was a bunch of stuff in my left column, the left side of my column, but the left side of my page, but it turns out I don't know anything. You've convinced me. Dream argument. That's one way to respond. The second way is to say, no, I know a lot of stuff, but it doesn't count as knowledge on this crazy Cartesian is just Descartes' name as an adjective. It doesn't count as knowledge on this crazy Cartesian standard that requires it to be infallible, right? That it can't be that I believe it and it's false. There are lots of things that we believe, even though they could be false, we have really good reasons for believing them, and we get to count them as knowledge, like that this is a quarter, or that this is a yoga ball, right? We get to count those things as knowledge because we have such strong evidence for them, namely our perception of them, even though it doesn't quite meet Descartes' standard for knowledge. So we're here, empiricism is a way of lowering the standards. Say, well, it doesn't have to be infallible or indubitable. Even though it could be that I'm asleep right now and all this is a fiction of my imagination and I'm going to wake up not having completed the lecture on chapter 3, to my dismay. It's very unlikely that that's the case. And so I feel confident enough that this is reality, that I'm actually looking at a computer screen with these balls in the quarter, that I can say that I know these things, because we can't get more sure than that this is a hand, right? That's about as sure as you get. And so if that doesn't count as knowledge, then nothing will. But don't worry, because it does count as knowledge. It's the best kind of knowledge we get. Knowledge from actually being in the world. You want to see an example? What color are your walls, right? Mine are sort of sea green, right? How do I know that? I looked at them, right? I just looked, and that's how I know. Is there somebody at my door? No, there's nobody at my door right now. How do I know? Because I just looked out the peephole and there was no one there at my door. Okay, this is how we come to know things. It's that easy. That's what the empiricist says. Okay, and we can be sure enough, even though we can't be as sure as Descartes and his I think stuff. That's just silly. We don't need to be that sure in order to know stuff. We know plenty of stuff. Like, if there's somebody else in your house right now, because you either see them or you hear nothing, or you don't live with anybody, or you do live with someone and you know that they're in their bedroom, right? And if you're not sure if they're in your house, you can go look and find out. And then you will be sure and you will have knowledge. That's all empiricism. If you believe that you get knowledge those kinds of ways, you might be an empiricist. Okay, we've looked at lots of problems with the theories of perception that we talked about. Naive realism, indirect realism, and idealism. We looked at problems with all those theories. Okay, so the empiricist, again, is going to need to say, the empiricist is going to need to say something about what perception is and how it works, and to have an answer to the problems we've looked at. But here's another problem for empiricism. And you might think this is a more threatening problem. This is the problem of induction. Okay, so remember, induction is inductive arguments from the previous chapter. That's what we're talking about, inductive arguments. How we move through induction from the premises of an argument to a conclusion. And the empiricist wants to say we don't just know the things we're directly experiencing in the moment, right? I don't just know that I'm wearing jeans right now because I feel them on my body. I don't just know the kinds of things that I can just perceive in this moment. I also use induction to draw conclusions about things, for example, in the future, and things that I'm not directly experiencing right now. Okay? And the empiricist relies on that because they think we can know lots of stuff. Empiricism is the basis of the scientific method. And the scientific method doesn't just count on things we directly observe in the moment. It relies on inferences that we draw using induction to draw conclusions about things we are not directly observing at the time. And so the problem of induction says, hold off, we are not justified in using induction. Okay, this is just not a justified way of reasoning. And if we want to have knowledge, we need our beliefs to be justified. That's the definition that we started with, right? So if induction is not justified, then, and you're an empiricist, then suddenly we don't get to count as knowing stuff anymore, except that stuff that's immediately in our perceptual experience. And most empiricists want us to get to count as knowing a lot more than that. Okay, so that's why this problem of induction is an objection to empiricism. Okay, so how does the problem of induction work? Well, take this inductive argument. There's a different one in the text, but I like this one. So the sun has risen every day so far. This is from David Hume. So the sun has risen every day so far. Therefore, the sun will rise tomorrow. This is an inductive argument. We're taking an enumerative inductive argument. We're taking a limited sample, a limited set of directly observed events, the sun rising every day so far, and extending that, in this case, by one more unobserved thing that we expect to happen, which is that the sun will rise tomorrow. Okay, that's our conclusion. Now, this is a very good inductive argument because it has a huge sample size. We're not extending the conclusion very far at all. It's almost infinitely small, this added event that we're expecting to happen, that we're claiming in the conclusion. It's infinitely small, the extra step that we take based on how many times, which is every day of your life, that you've observed personally the sun having risen, and millions of days beyond that humanity has witnessed the sun rising. So we're not making a very big jump, and that's why this is a very good inductive argument, because we're making a modest step forward. Okay, but the problem of induction is going to say even this very modest step is unjustified. Why is it unjustified? Well, how do we reason from the sun has risen every day so far to the sun will rise tomorrow? How do we get there? Well, the problem of induction points out that we are making an assumption. And the assumption is brought out in this second premise. The assumption is that nature is uniform. That I've abbreviated here with the letters PUN, which stands for the principle of the uniformity of nature. And what that says is that regularities that occurred in the past will keep occurring into the future. Okay, so we're making that assumption that the world isn't just freaky, like stuff just happens randomly that's never happened before with no explanation. The world doesn't work that way. Stuff happens according to consistent patterns, regularities. And when we observe those patterns for long enough, we can be confident that they will continue on into the future that we haven't yet observed. We're making this assumption. Okay, this is the first step in understanding the problem of induction, is understanding that this second premise, this premise that was implicit in the argument as I put it up originally, it was implicit. We're making that explicit here. And because that's an assumption that we have to make in order to move from the first premise to the conclusion of this argument. Well, what's the problem with this assumption? The problem is that we have no basis for accepting it. We have no reason to believe it, okay? And to see that, let's consider what kinds of reasons might be given in defense of this assumption. Okay, so now we're making PUN, the principle of the uniformity of nature, its own conclusion of the argument. And we're going to show that, or Hume thought he showed, that there's no good reason to accept this premise. And why is that? Well, how might we argue for this premise? How might we argue for this conclusion? So it's a conclusion of this argument, but it's a premise in our previous argument. How might we try to establish it? Well, we might start by noticing that in the past, stuff that's been observed long enough continued happening, right? Observed regularities have continued to hold. In the past, we've noticed that when we observe something happening consistently over and over and over, it keeps happening. Okay, what's the problem here? Well, again, there's an assumption in this argument that is required in order to move from the first premise to the conclusion. What's the assumption? The assumption is the conclusion itself, that because we've observed these regularities in the past, we'll continue to see them happen in the future, right? But that's just what we're trying to show. Okay, we're trying to show in this argument that PUN, the principle of the uniformity of nature, is correct, that nature is uniform, that freaky stuff doesn't happen just with no explanation when it's never been part of the way the world works in the past, right? But in order to show that, we have to assume that it's true, and that's called a circular argument, where you're not getting anywhere. We're having to assume the conclusion within our premises. But remember from our lecture on arguments, chapter 2, the whole point of an argument is to move us somewhere, to take us from stuff we accept and convince us to accept other stuff. If we're already starting with the other stuff, then the argument's not going to win anybody over, because nobody who doesn't already accept the conclusion is going to accept the premises. And that's exactly who you want an argument to reach, is people who accept the premises but don't accept the conclusion. That is the problem of induction. And remember, induction and empiricism, well, empiricism relies on induction, and together they form the basis of the scientific method. So we're in big trouble, especially if you are a science major in one of the sciences, hard sciences. I encourage you to think about this problem and take it seriously and try to think of how you might respond to this problem. First, you got to understand the problem. So one way to do that is to try to explain what I've been talking about in the past few minutes to somebody else, or to your dog, or yourself in the mirror. It will always help to explain these concepts to somebody else, because that will help you see where your understanding could use improvement. Okay, so So again, philosophy is active. You have to do it actively. You're not going to understand this stuff if all you're doing right now is listening. Well, you have to stop listening and try to explain it in your own words, even if that's just to yourself out loud, okay? Or try to write down the explanation, okay? Try to show you understand it. This will help you do better on the quizzes, I promise. Okay, so we've talked about empiricism, that it's the idea that knowledge is based on perception. We've talked about 3 different theories of perception: naive realism, indirect realism, and idealism. We've talked about problems that each of those theories of perception face. And now we've talked about the problem of induction, on which empiricism depends on induction. So if there's a problem with induction, it's a problem for empiricism. Okay, another way to think about the problem of induction is from Hume, who said, look, imagine you're a chicken, right? The chicken gets used to believing that every day when they hear the bell ring, the farmer comes and brings the food, right? Every single day. It's happened 3 months in a row, which is like almost 100 days. Every single time they hear the bell, the farmer comes and brings the food, until one day the bell rings, the farmer comes and cuts its head off, right? Never knew that that was going to happen. And that's a demonstration of the problem of induction, because if the chicken were a good empiricist, they would have believed that the bell rings on the 93rd day. That means the farmer's going to come and bring the food. But this time the bell rings, the farmer comes, and it ends completely differently. Okay, so the uniformity of nature fails from the perspective of the chicken in this story. Okay, but the uniformity of nature principle is required for induction. Okay, moving on to our last theory of the day, rationalism. Okay, so rationalism is a view that knowledge is based on a priori justifications. What's that mean? So a lot of this section of the lecture is just going to be an introduction of new concepts like a priori. Okay, so another way to understand a priori justification is justification based on reason. Okay, so again, we have these 3 theories of knowledge that we're looking at. Skepticism, which says we don't have knowledge. No beliefs are justified in the way that we would need them to be in order to count as knowledge. That's what the skeptic says. The empiricist and the rationalist both say we have lots of knowledge. What justifies our beliefs is different. They hold different views about what justifies our beliefs. The empiricist says perception is what justifies your beliefs most strongly, right? Fundamentally, what you can know most strongly is that, for example, you've got 2 hands, right? Because that is something you experience directly, and that is the surest way to get knowledge. The rationalist says, no, it's not about perception at all, because perception is constantly deceiving us, right? Think back to the quarter, round, straight. It's not telling us what's really going on, our perception, that is, for the rationalist. The rationalist thinks perception is just always misleading us, right? It's not just when you're dreaming. When you watch your friend walk away, it looks like they're getting smaller, but they're not getting smaller. You know they're not getting smaller, and you know that on the basis of reason. Reason is what justifies our beliefs in the strong way we need for those beliefs to count as knowledge. And another way to say based on reason, something that's based on reason, is a priori. That's what it means to be a priori, is to be based on reason, okay? Is to be something we can know to be true just by thinking about it. You can just close your eyes and come to the truth using your powers of reason, your rational powers of reason, okay? That's what the rationalist thinks gives us the surest hold on truth. The paradigm examples of beliefs that we can form based on reason are mathematical truths, right? 2 + 2 = 4. You know that not because you've discovered it in the world outside of your mind or felt 2 things or seen 2 things. You know that because once you have the concept of 2 and the concept of 4, you can close your eyes and concept of plus and equals and all those mathematical concepts involved in that, you can just close your eyes and know that that's true. It doesn't take any kind of perception. And the rationalist thinks that a priori justification, those things we know through reason, those things that are justified on the basis of reason, are the surest, most fundamental types of knowledge. A priori is contrasted with a posteriori, okay, a different kind of justification. A posteriori claims or justifications are based on perception and experience and looking into the outside world. Okay, they're the kinds of claims that scientists rely on, that scientists are trying to discover. It requires that you go out into the world and make observations of the world to have a posteriori knowledge or a posteriori justifications. A priori justifications, those that are based on reason, don't require that you go anywhere. And now think back to the cogito, where we started this lecture. Descartes' cogito begins from an a priori claim. I think that is the most famous a priori claim, perhaps. I think, because you can close your eyes and know it, according to Descartes. And Descartes' whole book on this subject is called The Meditations, most famous book. And the Meditations are stuff that he's discovering through meditating, right? He's sitting in his living room with his eyes closed next to a fire and noticing stuff in his mind, using his mind to notice stuff about reality, the nature of reality. And it's that kind of stuff that he can access just by thinking about it, that Descartes, because he's a rationalist, thinks forms the basis of all of our knowledge, right? Back to that bricklayer in the picture, right? Descartes thinks that those most solid bricks, those first pieces of knowledge to add to his whole collection, are a priori truths that he comes to based on reason alone. Okay, so empiricist says perception is where it's at. The rationalist says no, reason is where it's at. Okay, perception is always misleading us, leading us astray. Rationalism is rock solid, or a priori justifications are rock solid. That's what the rationalist says. Reason is rock solid. Okay, another pair of concepts in order to understand rationalism is these notions of necessary and contingent truth. So a necessary truth has to be true. It's going to be true no matter what actually comes to be in the world, right? Or no matter how the actual world is turning out. Okay, so I don't know what's going to happen between now and the inauguration. Today's January 13th. Today's the 10th. Okay. I just looked at my phone. Was that an empiricist belief I formed that today's the 10th, or a rationalist belief? I'll leave that to you. Okay. But I don't know what's going to happen between now and the next 10 days, or 10 days from now. But I do know that 1 + 1 = 2, no matter what happens in the next 10 days. 1 + 1 is still going to equal 2. And that makes it a necessary truth. That is, that it doesn't matter what actually happens in the world. Even if there were no world at all, even if there were no planets and no sun, 1 + 1 would still equal 2. That's how necessary it is. It has to be true, even if nothing ever existed. A contingent truth, on the other hand, is contingent on what turns out to be the case in the world. Okay, so maybe there will be more armed mobs storming our state legislatures. It's possible between now and Inauguration Day. Okay, if there are, then that will turn out to be a contingent truth. It is contingent on how events are going to unfold. It might be true and it might not be true. Maybe we will avert that kind of disaster. Okay, maybe I will have a salad for lunch. That's what I was thinking about. But maybe I'll open the fridge and realize I'm out of my key salad ingredients and make something else instead. Okay? Whatever happens will be contingently the case because it doesn't have to be true. But even if I don't have a salad, 1 plus 1 will still equal 2. And that's why 1 plus 1 is a necessary truth. Okay, so why are we talking about this? Well, rationalists believe the surest beliefs are necessary truths that we can determine are true based on reason alone. That is a priori justifications. Okay, one more set of concepts, and we're getting to the end of the lecture here, so it's almost time to go. But in order to understand some of the complaints against the rationalist, I want to introduce one more set of concepts, which is analytic and synthetic truth. So analytic truths are truths that are true by definition. Okay, there are a handful only of examples that philosophers are constantly throwing out to say what they mean by analytic truth. Like bachelors are unmarried males. That's one of them. Okay, now if we took a class on gender, we talk about how these terms are actually not what they seem to be. And so we challenge this definition and the way of conceiving of people in the first place. But we're not taking a class on gender. We're taking a class on introduction to philosophy, and now we're talking about analytic and synthetic truths. And bachelors are unmarried males is offered up again and again as this sort of prototypical example of an analytic truth. Okay, this is a paradigm of what analytic truth is. Truth by definition. Bachelors are unmarried. Triangles have 3 sides. That's what it is to be a triangle, is to be 3-sided, and a few other things. Okay, a synthetic truth is not true by definition. A synthetic truth, like I had coffee this morning. That's synthetic. It's got nothing to do with the definition of I. Or a synthetic truth like this dinosaur is opening and closing its mouth, right? It's not part of the definition of a dinosaur or a toy or anything that the dinosaur is opening its mouth. It just so happens that this dinosaur is being made to open its mouth right now, right? Lots of fun stuff around here. Okay, so analytic truths, true by definition. Synthetic truths, not true by definition. How does that help us understand the objection to rationalism? The objection says a priori justifications don't really tell us anything interesting about the world. All we do with a priori justification is analyze our concepts. Okay, so if you already have the concept, like of a bachelor or of a triangle, then you aren't learning anything when you come to know, quote unquote, that bachelors are unmarried or triangles have 3 sides. There's nothing interesting to learn from a priori reasoning. Okay, that's what the objection to rationalism says. It says, look, you think knowledge is based on a priori reasoning or justifications, but we don't really learn anything that way. Nothing that we didn't already know, just by having the concepts that we're using to assert those claims. Okay, that brings us to the end of this lecture. I look forward to hearing what questions you have and responding to those questions in a follow-up lecture. And I will see you soon.